World War I did not erupt from a single cause or moment. It was the product of a complex web of political tensions, military strategies, and social forces that had been building for decades. Traditional narratives often point to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo as the sole trigger, but modern scholarship emphasizes that this shot in Sarajevo was only the spark in a powder keg. The ensuing conflict was a product of miscalculation, misunderstanding, and miscommunication, and historians note it might have been averted at many points during the 5 weeks of crisis that followed. In reality, a multitude of long-term factors, alliances, imperial ambitions, arms races, nationalist fervor, combined with short-term decisions and mistakes to produce a war few truly anticipated in scale. Contemporary researchers have reinterpreted these origins, challenging the conventional blame game and revealing deeper structural flaws in early 20th century geopolitics. This report provides a holistic overview of how World War I started, focusing on the political and military causes while also incorporating economic, cultural, and philosophical factors that shaped the path to war. Key insights from modern historians will highlight thought-provoking ideas and lesser-known events, from critiques of the Sarajevo narrative to the role of imperialism and diplomatic missteps that complicate our understanding of the war's origins. By 1914, Europe's great powers had coalesced into two opposing alliance systems. On one side stood the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy would remain neutral in 1914. On the other, the Entente Powers, France, Russia, and Britain, joined by Serbia and others. These alliances were the product of decades of diplomatic maneuvering. Germany's rise after unification in 1871 and its 1879 alliance with Austria-Hungary, joined by Italy in 1882, upset the old balance of power. France, humiliated by loss of territory in the 1870-71 Franco-Prussian War, eagerly entered an alliance with Russia in 1893 to counter German power. Britain, traditionally splendidly isolated, settled its colonial disputes with France 1904 and Russia 1907, forming a loose triple entente that further heightened German fears of encirclement. These alliance blocs meant that a conflict involving one great power could rapidly draw in others. In previous diplomatic crises, such as the two Moroccan crises, 1905 and 1911, when Germany challenged French ambitions in Morocco, or the Balkan crises, the great powers had backed their allies with threats, yet full war was avoided. However, each standoff left tensions higher. Notably, when Germany tried to block France's takeover of Morocco, Britain sided firmly with France, deepening Germany's isolation. By the summer of 1914, the stage was set for a chain reaction. As the Imperial War Museum observes, Europe's leaders made decisions for war in the context of growing nationalism, increased militarism, imperial rivalry, and competition for power and influence, with alliance commitments turning a localized dispute into a continental conflict. The alliances were intended as deterrents, but once the July 1914 crisis began, they became transmission belts of war. Austria-Hungary knew its attack on Serbia would likely trigger Russian intervention, so it turned to its own ally, Germany, for backup. Germany, in turn, felt bound to support Austria-Hungary to maintain its only reliable ally and to avoid being encircled by enemies. France was bound to Russia, and Britain was pulled in by German violation of Belgian neutrality and fears of a single power dominating Europe. In this system, even powers that tried to stay out could hardly avoid the pull. One British statesman later lamented that the nations slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war, unable to escape the obligations and fears the alliance network had created. Importantly, modern historians note that the alliances were not absolute chains. Italy managed to stay neutral in 1914 despite its treaty with Germany and Austria-Hungary, But the perceptions of solid blocks and the secrecy of some agreements bred fatal miscalculations. The alliance system was a necessary precondition for a world war, but it was intertwined with imperial ambitions, military plans, and nationalist pressures that made a general war possible, and, in the minds of some leaders, perhaps even inevitable. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were an era of aggressive imperialism. European powers competed for colonies, resources, and global prestige. These imperial rivalries both fed and were fed by the alliance tensions in Europe. Germany, a newly unified nation late to the colonial scramble, pursued a Weltpolitik, world policy, to acquire colonies and a navy to rival Britain's. Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany embarked on a naval arms race, building dreadnought battleships that Britain saw as a direct threat to its dominance of the seas. This naval race seriously strained relations between the two nations. At the same time, Germany's quest for a greater global role provoked crises. For example, in 1905 and 1911, Germany challenged French influence in Morocco, hoping to split the British-French Entente. But Britain instead backed France, increasing German leaders' fear that their empire is being hemmed in by an Anglo-French-Russian coalition. Such incidents convinced German elites that only bold action could secure their place in the sun. Other powers were equally driven by imperial interests. Britain was determined to maintain its vast empire and the global trade routes that sustained its economy. German expansion, whether a naval presence or a Berlin-Baghdad railway through the Ottoman Empire, was seen as a menacing encroachment. Such incidents convinced German elites that only bold action could secure their place in the sun. Other powers were equally driven by imperial interests. Britain was determined to maintain its vast empire and the global trade routes that sustained its economy. German expansion, whether a naval presence or a Berlin-Baghdad railway through the Ottoman Empire, was seen as a menacing encroachment. Britain's foreign policy before 1914, in fact, was guided by protecting its empire and maintaining a balance of power in Europe. France, besides seeking revenge against Germany for past defeats, wanted to protect and expand its colonial empire from North Africa to Indochina, and thus aligned with Britain against German ambitions. Russia, the largest empire on land, had its own imperial aims. It desired influence in the Balkans and access to warm water ports, eyeing the fading Ottoman Empire's territories. Russia styled itself the protector of Slavic peoples, notably the Serbs, partly to extend its sway in southeastern Europe. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary struggled to hang on to its imperial domain in the face of restive ethnic groups and saw expansion, or at least dominance, in the Balkans as a way to secure its empire's future. These imperial drives were often couched in the era's ideological justifications. The philosophy of social Darwinism, which applied the concept of survival of the fittest to nations and races, was widespread among European elites. It fostered a view that international politics was a struggle in which only the strong would thrive. This outlook indirectly contributed to World War I by encouraging militarism and a zero-sum mindset. If one believed one's nation had to keep expanding or else decline, compromise seemed like weakness. German intellectuals spoke of a Kampf, struggle among nations, and even in Britain and France, many saw imperial competition as a necessary test of vitality. Thus, colonial conflicts abroad heightened the sense that a major war in Europe might be inevitable to sort out the great powers' pecking order. Lenin later famously argued that World War I was the natural outcome of capitalist imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, where great powers fought over colonies and markets. While that Marxist interpretation is one of many, it underscores that economic rivalries, industrial output, trade dominance, access to resources underpinned the geopolitical tensions. By 1914, Germany's economy had eclipsed Britain's in steel and coal production, rattling the British, while German leaders fretted that without new markets and colonies, their late-coming empire would be relegated to second-class status. All the great powers, in other words, had ambitions that extended far beyond their borders, and they were willing to risk war to defend or advance these interests. As one historian notes, Europe's leaders in 1914 were willing to go to war to defend or extend national interests, and were guided by long and short-term goals that often involved imperial gains. Underlying the alliance and imperial tensions was a pervasive militarism, a cultural admiration of military power, and a political preference for military solutions. In the decades leading up to World War I, the great powers poured enormous resources into armaments. Most continental powers had adopted conscription, building vast reserves of trained men. Europe's leaders saw military strength as an essential part of being a great power, and each nation maintained a mass army and navy commensurate with its ambitions. Germany and France doubled down on army expansions after a series of pre-war scares. Britain, secure behind its navy, still implemented plans for a British expeditionary force, ready to fight on the continent if needed. The result was an arms race on land and sea. From 1900 to 1914, military spending by the European powers skyrocketed, and new technologies, machine guns, battleships, heavy artillery, were developed that would later make the war so devastating. Militarism also manifested in the influence of generals and admirals on state policy. In Germany, the General Staff, led by figures like Helmut von Moltke, wielded immense authority. Kaiser Wilhelm II often deferred to military advice. In Germany and France, detailed war plans were devised to maximize speed and offensive power in the event of war. The result was an arms race on land and sea. From 1900 to 1914, military spending by the European powers skyrocketed, and new technologies, machine guns, battleships, heavy artillery, were developed that would later make the war so devastating. Militarism also manifested in the influence of generals and admirals on state policy. In Germany, the General Staff, led by figures like Helmut von Moltke, wielded immense authority. Kaiser Wilhelm II often deferred to military advice. In Germany and France, detailed war plans were devised to maximize speed and offensive power in the event of war. Germany's plan, conceived by Count von Schlieffen and modified by Moltke, envisioned a rapid offensive through Belgium to defeat France in 6 weeks, then a pivot east to face the slower-to-mobilize Russians. This Schlieffen plan was a rigid timetable that left no room for diplomacy once set in motion. France's plan, V-17, similarly focused on a bold offensive into Alsace-Lorraine. All major armies believed that seizing the initiative and attacking was the key to victory, a mentality later dubbed the cult of the offensive. Military strategists before 1914 tended to underestimate defensive firepower, like machine guns, and overestimate the ability of morale and maneuver to overcome any foe. This bias meant that once a crisis began, generals were predisposed to favor quick mobilization and strike first. Political leaders often felt compelled to go along, lest delay invite disaster if war was indeed coming. The arms race was not only about planning, but also fear. Germany, for example, feared Russia's growing military might. Russian reforms and railway building in the early 1900s meant that by around 1916-17, Russia would have a much stronger army and quicker mobilization. German military leadership in 1914 was keenly aware of this trajectory. As the IWM notes, German generals feared Russia's growing military power and were ready to strike before it was too late. This reveals a critical motive: preventive war thinking. Germany's leaders did not necessarily want a large war in 1914, but some concluded that if war was inevitable, it was better now than later, when their enemies would be stronger. Austria-Hungary likewise worried that if it did not crush Serbia soon, Serbian and other South Slav nationalism would only grow more threatening. This logic created a perilous inclination to resort to force sooner rather than later. Another structural flaw was the lack of flexibility in mobilization. Once one country began to call up reservists and assemble armies, others felt they must do the same or be caught at a disadvantage. In 1914, this use it or lose it dilemma was acute. Russia's partial mobilization on July 30 was intended as a precaution, but Germany's plan interpreted any Russian mobilization as an existential threat that required immediate German mobilization and war. The schedules were so tight that diplomatic options were constrained by military timetables. As one analysis puts it, World War I was in part the result of malfunction of international order, where rigid war plans and secret fears pushed nations into conflict almost on autopilot. Military leaders had a say in July 1914 that sometimes overrode or pressured the civilian diplomats. In Germany, for instance, when Kaiser Wilhelm II hesitated upon news that Britain might remain neutral, General Moltke urged that the deployment must proceed regardless. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II initially wavered on ordering mobilization, but was persuaded by his generals that partial measures would be chaotic and full mobilization was needed. In short, militarism and war planning created an environment where once the spark was lit, it became extremely difficult to avoid a large-scale war. As George Kennan later wrote, World War I was the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, born from an era when might often outranked right. The reverence of military values and planning for war had primed the pump for an explosion. Intense nationalism was another critical force leading to World War I, and its most volatile hotspot was the Balkans, often called the powder keg of Europe. In the decades before 1914, nationalist movements surged among Europe's peoples, redrawing maps and inflaming rivalries. The great powers themselves were imbued with nationalism. France nurtured revanchist sentiment to recover Alsace-Lorraine from Germany and assert its honor. Germany prided itself on its rapid rise and sought its place in the sun. Britain believed in its imperial destiny and naval supremacy. But nowhere was nationalism more destabilizing than in Austria-Hungary's southeastern flank, where the ambitions of Serbian nationalism collided with the interests of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary was a multinational empire ruling Slovenes, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Poles, Ukrainians, and others alongside Austrians and Hungarians. In the early 20th century, ethnic Slavs in the empire increasingly looked to independent Serbia as both an inspiration and potential liberator. Serbia, a small kingdom with outsized nationalist aspirations, dreamed of uniting all South Slavs, Yugoslavs, under its leadership, including those under Austro-Hungarian rule. This vision was termed Pan-Slavism, with Russia as a patron of Slavic unity, or specifically South Slav unity. Tensions spiked in 1908 when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, a province with a large Serb population that it had already occupied since 1878. The Bosnian annexation crisis infuriated Serbia, which had hoped to incorporate Bosnia, and embarrassed Russia, which, weakened from the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, had to accept Austria's move. One historian calls the 1908 annexation the prelude to World War I, though at that time war was averted because Russia and Serbia backed down. Still, it left deep resentment. Serbian nationalists formed secret societies like Unification or Death, the Black Hand, dedicated to undermining Austro-Hungarian rule in the Balkans. For the next years, Austria-Hungary and Serbia engaged in a Cold War of propaganda and subversion. The Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 further stoked Serbian nationalism. Serbia doubled in size after defeating Ottoman forces and saw itself as the liberator of South Slavs, gaining territory and prestige. Austria-Hungary, by contrast, viewed an empowered Serbia as an existential threat, a magnet drawing its South Slav subjects toward rebellion. In Vienna, the feeling was that Serbia's growth had to be checked at all costs. As the IWM notes, Austria had long seen Serbia as a menace to the stability of its multi-ethnic empire, and Serbian agitation, plus Serbia's ties with Russia, made the region extremely volatile. By 1914, leaders in Vienna were openly contemplating that a war to destroy Serbia might be necessary sooner rather than later. It was in this context that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo, the capital of annexed Bosnia, on 28 June 1914. His visit was deliberately on the Serbian national holiday, Vidovdan, seen as a provocation by some Serbian extremists. A group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists, supplied in part by shadowy figures in Serbian military intelligence, plotted to assassinate the Archduke to strike a blow for the cause of South Slav independence. On that fateful day, Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators, succeeded in shooting Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie as they traveled in an open car. The royal couple died within hours. This assassination is often cited as the trigger for World War I, and indeed it set the crisis in motion. But modern interpretations emphasize that the act itself did not make a continental war inevitable. At the time, many Europeans reacted with shock and sympathy, but not with immediate war hysteria. In fact, observers noted relative apathy and indifference in the weeks after the murder. It was not assumed that this would automatically lead to a world war. One British official in July 1914 wrote that he did not expect the Sarajevo incident to lead to further complications. The outrage began to slip from memory in those weeks. Political assassinations were sadly not uncommon in that era, and the Archduke himself had not been widely beloved. What turned this tragic killing into a global catastrophe was what came next: the decisions by Austria-Hungary and other great powers during the July crisis. It is here that nationalist passions played a decisive role. For Austria-Hungary's leaders, the assassination was not merely a crime. It was an intolerable affront by Serbia that had to be avenged to uphold imperial honor and deter future nationalist plots. The Austro-Hungarian Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold and Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf seized on the incident as the perfect pretext to crush the Serbian threat once and for all. In their eyes, Serbian nationalism was a poison that had to be eliminated through force of arms. To back down after the Archduke's murder would signal weakness and invite the collapse of Austria's authority over its Slavic subjects. This concept of national honor and prestige was highly influential. As scholars note, both Vienna and St. Petersburg were motivated by fears that if they backed down, they would lose credibility and prestige as great powers. Austria-Hungary was determined to assert itself, even at risk of a wider war, while Serbia, for its part, was fiercely protective of its sovereignty and dignity. It could not humbly admit complicity in the assassination, which the Serbian government officially hadn't directed, without losing face in front of its own people. Russia, driven by pan-Slavic solidarity and its own credibility, felt it could not abandon Serbia again as it had in 1908. In sum, nationalism had created a situation where compromise was equated with dishonor. This cult of honor, and even a crisis of masculinity among European elites, as historian Christopher Clark suggests, made leaders eager to prove their resolve and manhood in the face of challenges. It is sobering to consider that, as Clark muses, the war might have begun in part because upper-class statesmen and generals felt their status threatened by any show of weakness. They vied to prove their virility in battle, almost sleepwalking into a war to preserve their pride. After Franz Ferdinand's assassination on June 28, 1914, a tense but deceptively quiet period ensued for about 3 weeks. Behind the scenes, Austria-Hungary's top officials deliberated their response. Crucially, they sought and received Germany's unconditional support for punitive action against Serbia. On 5 July 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his chancellery gave Austria what has been called the blank check, a promise that Germany would back Austria-Hungary even if its actions led to war with Russia. This blank check emboldened Vienna. Austrian leaders, now confident that the mighty German Empire had their back, prepared an ultimatum designed to be so harsh that Serbia would likely reject it, giving a casus belli. They waited until late July, after a summit between French and Russian leaders concluded, to deliver the ultimatum, to ensure Russia and France had minimal time to coordinate a response. On 23 July, Austria-Hungary presented Serbia with an ultimatum containing a long list of demands, including that Austrian officials participate in Serbia's investigation of the assassination, a severe violation of Serbian sovereignty. Even Austria's ally Germany expected some Serbian refusal. Astonishingly, Serbia, under Russian advice, accepted most of the demands and only partially rejected a couple of points, such as foreign investigators on its soil. Nevertheless, Austria-Hungary was intent on starting a war with Serbia and used the partial demurral as an excuse to break off diplomacy. Kaiser Wilhelm, upon hearing Serbia's conciliatory reply, noted it was very satisfactory. "The most conciliatory I have ever seen," he said. But by then, the Austro-Hungarian leadership had made up its mind for war, and Germany's own military were eager to press their advantage. On 28 July 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The very next day, Austrian artillery began shelling Belgrade. These were effectively the first shots of World War I, though few realized it at the time. The localized Austro-Serbian conflict now set the great power alliances into motion. Russia, having pledged support to Serbia, faced a fateful choice. Tsar Nicholas II initially hoped for a partial mobilization, only against Austria-Hungary, to threaten Vienna into halting aggression. But Russian generals warned that partial measures would create chaos in their plans. If Russia mobilized at all, Germany would likely do the same. As Serbia's tiny army struggled, pan-Slavic opinion in Russia clamored to not let Serbia be crushed. On 30 July, Russia escalated by ordering a general mobilization of its armed forces. The Russians viewed this as a defensive necessity, a precaution in case war broke out. But to Germany, it was an alarming signal. Germany had warned Russia not to mobilize. Now that it had, Germany's own war plan, fearing a two-front war, demanded immediate action. Germany thus issued an ultimatum to Russia on 31 July to halt mobilization. When it received no satisfactory answer, Germany declared war on Russia on 1 August 1914. At this point, the dominoes were truly falling. France, bound by treaty and eager not to let its Russian ally be defeated, and also eyeing its chance to reclaim lost provinces from Germany, began mobilizing as well. German Foreign Minister von Jagow famously told the departing Russian ambassador, "We are now in a state of necessity and shall act," underscoring that Germany felt forced by circumstances to go to war or lose the initiative. A dramatic side note during these hours highlights how miscommunication among the powers added to the tragedy. On 1 August, there was a momentary misunderstanding between Germany and Britain. Germany's ambassador in London, Prince Lichnowsky, misunderstood British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey to have implied that Britain might remain neutral if Germany did not attack France. When this misinformation reached Kaiser Wilhelm II, he jubilantly ordered a postponement of the Western offensive, fantasizing that he could direct his forces solely against Russia. However, this hope was shattered within hours when it became clear Britain had made no such promise. It was a diplomatic mix-up. The Kaiser reportedly exclaimed that his soldiers would have to march after all. This incident, though fleeting, exemplifies how poor communication and false assumptions greased the slide to war. Gray, in fact, was desperately trying to mediate. As early as 24 July, he had proposed an international conference to defuse the crisis, and even up to 1-3 August, he was in tense exchanges to avoid a wider war. Germany's refusal of a conference and insistence on backing Austria's hard line meant diplomatic options were closing one by one. Germany now activated the Schlieffen Plan in full. On 3 August 1914, Germany declared war on France, preemptively, since France had not yet attacked but was bound to side with Russia, and launched an invasion of neutral Belgium to outflank French defenses. The violation of Belgian neutrality was a pivotal move. Britain had not explicitly promised to fight for France or Russia, but it had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality in an 1839 treaty. Moreover, a Germany that defeated France and dominated Belgium right across the English Channel was unacceptable to London. The British government had been divided, and public opinion was not initially keen on war over a Balkan quarrel. But when news came that German troops were pouring into Belgium, the outrage tipped the balance. Britain also had strategic reasons. Allowing Germany to conquer France and Belgium would destroy the European balance of power that Britain felt was essential for its own security. Finally, at 11 p.m. on 4 August 1914, after its ultimatum to Germany to withdraw from Belgium went unanswered, Britain declared war on Germany. With Britain's entry, along with its global empire and dominions, the conflict had truly become a world war. To summarize the cascading events of that fateful summer, here is a brief timeline of the July crisis and early August 1914. 28 June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. While shocking, the event itself does not immediately cause a Europe-wide war. Many leaders see it as a regional issue. 5 July 1914. Germany gives Austria-Hungary a blank check, assuring it full support even if action against Serbia brings about war with Russia. This guarantee hardens Austria's resolve. 23 July 1914. Austria-Hungary, after weeks of preparation, delivers an ultimatum to Serbia with extremely harsh terms. Serbia, backed by Russia, responds conciliatorily on 25 July, but Austria declares the reply unsatisfactory. 28 July 1914. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia and begins bombardment of Belgrade. The local conflict ignites the alliance fuse. 30 July 1914. Russia orders general mobilization of its armies to intimidate Austria-Hungary and protect Serbia. Germany interprets this as a dire threat and prepares its own mobilization. 1 August 1914. Germany declares war on Russia. France, allied to Russia, mobilizes its forces. A last-minute misunderstanding leads Kaiser Wilhelm II to briefly believe Britain might stay neutral, but this hope is quickly dashed. 3 August 1914. Germany declares war on France and invades Belgium, implementing the Schlieffen Plan. Belgium resists, and its plight galvanizes international sympathy. 4 August 1914. Britain declares war on Germany after the violation of Belgian neutrality, citing its treaty obligations and the threat to the balance of power. The World War begins in earnest, with all great powers now involved. During the crisis, there were moments when cooler heads almost prevailed. For instance, Serbia's partial capitulation, or Kaiser Wilhelm's late realization that war with France might be avoided, or Sir Edward Grey's calls for negotiation. But these were overwhelmed by hawkish counsels and the inexorable logic of distrust. As one analysis notes, World War I emerged from miscalculation, misunderstanding, and miscommunication. Leaders consistently overestimated threats and underestimated the chances of averting war. Each power believed it was acting defensively against aggressive foes, a view reinforced by secret alliances and mobilization timetables that obscured intentions. In short, Europe's statesmen sleepwalked through a diplomatic minefield, and when the mines began to detonate, they found themselves engulfed in an unstoppable conflagration. For decades after World War I, debates raged over war guilt. Who was to blame for starting the conflict? The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, famously assigned sole blame to Germany and its allies, which satisfied the victor's need for accountability but oversimplified the complex causes. Modern scholarship has moved away from singling out one nation, instead highlighting the shared responsibility and the structural conditions that led to war. Historians now argue that no single country or leader wanted a world war. There was no grand conspiracy to unleash a 4-year bloodbath, but a multitude of decisions by all sides contributed to the catastrophe. In the words of historian Christopher Clark, the European powers sleepwalked into war, not really understanding the horror they were about to unleash. Clark's influential book The Sleepwalkers, 2012, portrays 1914 as a tragedy of collective failure. German militarism and paranoid imperialism were met with Russian insecurity and French resolve. Austro-Hungarian aggression met Serbian nationalism, and British ambivalence ultimately gave way to intervention, a toxic interplay rather than a single villain. This challenges the older narrative that Germany deliberately caused the war. In the 1960s, historian Fritz Fischer sparked a revolution by arguing that Imperial Germany did in fact bear primary blame, that it used the July crisis to launch a bid for European domination, pointing to German leaders' annexationist war aims and a key War Council meeting in 1912 as evidence of intent. Fischer's thesis that Germany had a continuity of militaristic expansionism leading to Hitler provoked intense debate. Documents like the December 1912 War Council, where Kaiser Wilhelm II and his generals discussed the likelihood of war in a few years' time, can be read in multiple ways. Some scholars see it as proof that Germany planned a war for 1914-15. Others argue it was a contingency discussion, or even the Kaiser's impulsive bluster, not a fixed policy. The Fischer versus Ritter historiographical debate highlighted that even with archival evidence, context is everything. The same document can suggest aggressive intent or reactive anxiety. Today's consensus, if there is one, usually concedes that Germany encouraged the escalation, the blank check being a key enabling factor, but also stresses that Austria-Hungary drove the initial war with Serbia. Russia escalated by backing Serbia militarily. France gave Russia confidence to act, and Britain's actions, or inaction, influenced German calculations. In short, responsibility was broadly distributed. Each government made choices that contributed to war, and importantly, each believed it was acting defensively or preventively. As the July crisis documents show, every power thought it was reacting to others' provocations, a tragic spiral of self-justified moves. Modern reinterpretations also question the inevitability of World War I. Earlier generations often viewed the war as a result of unstoppable forces, alliances, arms races, nationalist fervor that made a great war sooner or later unavoidable. Yet newer research, especially after the peaceful end of the Cold War, asks instead, why did peace prevail for decades and what finally made it break? Some historians, like Holger Afflerbach, argue that many leaders actually saw war as improbable and strove to avoid it until the last moments. It was not a general lust for war that propelled them, but a series of specific fears and misjudgments during the crisis. For instance, far from seeking war, German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg in 1914 was anxious about Germany's encirclement and hoped a strong stance might localize the conflict. He did not anticipate a world war resulting from the Austrian move on Serbia. Similarly, Russia's Tsar was reluctant and famously telegraphed Kaiser Wilhelm Niki to Willy in a personal exchange, desperately hoping to avoid war even as their generals mobilized. These human elements show that contingency and miscommunication, not just impersonal forces, played a huge role. Indeed, an entire body of scholarly work examines the July 1914 crisis management, or mismanagement. The failure of diplomacy, the role of blunders like the above-mentioned British-German misunderstanding, and the absence of international mediation mechanisms. One striking observation is that Europe had no robust system to peacefully arbitrate such a severe dispute. The concert of Europe that had kept relative peace for a century broke down, and there was no League of Nations, founded only after the war, to step in. Thus, a localized event cascaded without breaks. In hindsight, many contemporaries and historians lament how close the statesmen came to stopping the catastrophe, only to falter. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George later reflected that nations slithered into war by accident, and another statesman recalled it as the lights going out all over Europe, not to be lit again in their lifetimes. Scholars have also shed light on cultural and intellectual currents that primed Europe for war. Beyond nationalism and social Darwinism, ideas of militarist virtue, honor, and even utopian notions of war were in the air. Some elites believed a short, vigorous war might serve as a social cleanser, to shore up traditional values against socialism, or to reinvigorate a nation's spirit. There was a widespread war enthusiasm in early August 1914 in many capitals, massive rallies and volunteer enlistments, which suggests that many citizens and intellectuals had come to see war as a legitimate or even noble pursuit, at least initially. However, recent studies complicate this too, noting that enthusiasm was not universal, and many met the war news with dread or resignation. Still, the prevailing atmosphere glorified military heroism and sacrifice. That cultural backdrop made it easier for governments to rally support when war broke out. As one historian Riley noted, beliefs and norms like honor can incentivize violence and war rather than restraint. In 1914, the concept of backing down or seeking compromise was often equated with weakness or dishonor in the minds of decision-makers, a fatal mindset that modern commentators view as a profound structural flaw in the international system of the time. In re-evaluating the start of World War I, contemporary historians often highlight lesser-known factors. For example, the role of individual personalities, the personal insecurities and biases of Kaiser Wilhelm, Tsar Nicholas, etc., the impact of domestic politics, Germany's elite worrying about the rise of socialism at home, or the Austro-Hungarian leadership using war to reinforce internal unity, and the element of chance. Had Franz Ferdinand's driver not taken a wrong turn that put him in Princip's gun range, the war might have been delayed or averted. These nuances do not change the fundamental causes, but they enrich our understanding that July-August 1914 was not a simple, mechanical outcome of alliances and hatred. It was an interplay of structure and agency. Long-term rivalries and armaments created the possibility of a massive war, but the war only happened due to choices made or not made by specific men in a specific context. As historian Margaret Macmillan put it, war was not inevitable until it actually happened. The outbreak of World War I was the result of a perfect storm of factors: political, military, economic, cultural, and sheer human folly. Politically, a fragile system of alliances intended for security produced a domino effect, and leaders in 1914 were bound as much by fears of losing credibility as by formal treaties. Militarily, arms races and war plans created an atmosphere where each power felt pressured to strike quickly or be struck down, feeding a spiral of escalation. Economically and imperially, the great powers' ambitions for colonies, markets, and resources led to rivalry and distrust that set the stage for conflict. Culturally and philosophically, fervent nationalism, social Darwinist might makes right thinking, and notions of honor and destiny diminished the barriers to war. When the heir to Austria-Hungary was assassinated by a nationalist in Sarajevo, it was like a match tossed onto dry kindling, not an isolated incident, but one that stoked old tensions and gave hawks in Vienna and Berlin the excuse to act aggressively. The ensuing July crisis saw diplomacy give way to ultimatums and mobilizations, in a climate of miscommunication and miscalculation so profound that, as one analysis concludes, no one expected the size or length of the war that came.
Each decision, Austria's demand for war, Germany's blank check, Russia's pledge to Serbia, France's backing of Russia, Britain's signaling, added logs to the fire, until it became a conflagration beyond any single nation's control. By early August 1914, Europe's leaders had plunged their nations into a war that would shatter the world they knew. In hindsight, World War I stands as a sobering lesson in how a combination of structural factors, like alliance entanglements and power imbalances, and contingent events, like a murder in the Balkans and 1 month of rash decisions, can lead to catastrophe. It challenges us to understand history not as a simple chain of cause and effect, but as a complex system where ideology, emotion, and misperception can be just as consequential as cannons and treaties. The traditional focus on the Sarajevo assassination as the cause of WI1 is now regarded as dangerously simplistic, a myth that overlooks the deeper causes and the agency of the statesmen who failed to prevent war. As modern scholarship reveals, the First World War was the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century precisely because it was not inevitable or planned by all-powerful fate. It was the outcome of choices made in a climate of fear, ambition, and mutual distrust.
The story of how World War I started is therefore a cautionary tale. Even the most civilized and interconnected societies can, through a cascade of errors and confrontational policies, slither into a conflict that nobody truly wants. Understanding that holistic context, political, military, economic, cultural, not only provides a more accurate history, but also imparts wisdom for preventing such a tragedy from ever occurring again.